Hi, I'm Bill Reid, and I am the lawyer who provides the legal service to Mohawk College students through the Mohawk Students Association. Today we're going to talk about employment law, and we can move to the first slide with content, which will be one after this.
Sorry, it's just not working.
Okay, so as we indicate this, I'm not purporting to give individual people legal advice at this time. I'm making this presentation. It's for information purposes only, but I am available for individual consultation. And by all means, students will provide an email address at the end of the presentation to contact me at, and then I can give you individual legal advice and assistance on your own situations. But like I say, today we're just providing general information, and we can move on to the next slide. So in Ontario, there is an Employment Standards Act, and that is the law that governs most employment situations. And I just mentioned Ontario because employment generally is a matter that is dealt with by individual provinces. The federal government deals with employment of people in federally regulated industries, but that is the minority of industries. Certain things like air travel and banking, but most things that people would be working at in Ontario, they would fall within the Ontario Employment Standards Act. Again, we make a distinction if someone is not really an employee, but is an independent contractor, just working by an agreement that is different from employment. But again, most situations, especially that a student would encounter, they are technically employed. And an employer would provide government forms for the student to fill out, and the employer would issue payment and also pay stubs that show that they're making deductions for income tax, certain other things. And so that is how true employment operates in the vast majority of situations, especially that students would be in if they're working, would be true employment governed by the Government of Ontario and its Employment Standards Act. So again, that act sets out certain rights relating to issues such as wages, hours of work, vacation, termination of employment, and leaves of absence. And we're going to talk about those various things. And we can move on to the next slide. So, wages, for one thing. So, issues relating to wages include the establishment of a minimum wage, also how and when wages are paid, by which I mean that it has to be by way of a paper form with that pay stub that I mentioned that shows the total and the deductions, and how frequently, the requirement to issue a pay statement, as I said, and what deductions are allowed. Certain deductions are required. Others may be in addition, for instance, if there is a union that the employee is a member of, and then other deductions would not be allowed that employers sometimes try to make. Issues relating to hours of work include like a daily limit on the number of hours, a weekly limit, the number of hours free from work, which includes breaks and also how long there has to be between shifts. And so all of those things pertain to the hours that an employee can work and the wages that they pay, that they're paid. And we can move on to the next slide. So vacation. Well, the issues that the Employment Standards Act deals with pertaining to vacation include the number of vacation days to which an employee is entitled, vacation pay, which is the additional amount that employees earn so that they are able to take paid vacation. And one of two things, either they are paid while they're on vacation, or they're paid extra when they're not on vacation, so that it works out to the same. But the Act requires one of those two things to occur. And there are different amounts of vacation pay depending upon how long an employee has been employed by the same employer. And then also the calculation of vacation pay upon termination of employment. And that doesn't only mean if the employer fires the employee, but if the employment terminates for any reason, including if the employee quits. They may be entitled to vacation that they had earned and not yet taken. Most employees also get statutory holidays off with pay, but that is a separate matter from vacation. There is vacation, and there are statutory holidays, two separate things. And we can move on to the next slide. So I mentioned before about termination, and an employee has the right to quit. The Act indicates that an employee technically should provide 2 weeks' notice. Employers sometimes have valid reasons to require that. Other times they really don't, and they usually don't require that an employee give a full 2 weeks if they want to quit and leave sooner. Most employers will allow them to do that, and of course they'll only pay for the days that they work. If they don't give 2 weeks' notice, if an employee doesn't give 2 weeks' notice when they quit, well, they can't expect to be paid for those 2 weeks. If they give a week's notice, that's how many days they get paid for. But when the employer is terminating, the rules are more strict, and issues relating to an employer terminating include how much notice the employee receives, and that depends on how long they have worked. Also, whether the employee is entitled to severance pay, which is a separate thing from notice of termination. People sometimes use severance as an umbrella term to refer to all notice of termination, all payment in lieu of notice, and it's not. When an employee is terminated, an employer, unless they can show that there is cause and that it's the employee's fault, the employer has to give the employee notice or pay equivalent to notice. Well, that means that, again, the Act indicates how many weeks an employee is entitled to depending upon how long they've worked. So the employer has to say this, I'm giving you notice, that number of weeks is the end of your employment. Or the employer may say, I don't want you after today, but I still have to pay you. Here's a check, or it will come soon, payment for that number of weeks that you're entitled to. So it can be working notice whereby an employee is given notice of how many weeks they have left to work, or it can be pay in lieu of notice, which is a French word for instead of notice. And the employee can be paid that required number of weeks without having to work. Severance is a different thing. Severance is an additional payment on top of that, which only some employers are required to pay, and only if they're larger employees and they have a much larger payroll than the average employer, or if they terminate a large number of employees at the same time. Most employees from most small to medium-sized employers are not entitled to severance as such, but again, they get notice of termination. And in terms of termination, the other issue is layoff. An employer may lay an employee off, but they're required to bring them back after a certain number of weeks, and in most cases that is 17 weeks. If the employer brings the employee back within that time, that's fine. They have the right to lay the employee off temporarily. If the employer does not bring the employee back after that number of weeks, it automatically becomes termination, and the employer is required to treat it as termination and to give the employee payment instead of the amount of notice that they would be entitled to if they were terminated. So I realize that the rules are a little bit complex, and it's difficult to make them any simpler in a presentation like this, but I hope that by mentioning all of that and seeing the PowerPoint, students can realize that there are a number of issues that they should be aware of. And again, we'll come back at the end of the presentation to how to contact me directly to discuss individual situations. In the meantime, we can move on to the next slide. An employee is entitled to certain kinds of leaves of absence: pregnancy leave, parental leave, sick leave, family responsibility leave, bereavement leaves. These leaves are unpaid by the employer, but the employee in some of those cases will qualify for employment insurance from the federal government during pregnancy leave or parental leave. In those two cases, the employer must allow the employee to be off, but then the government, the federal government, through the employment insurance system, pays the employee in those two cases. There are other kinds of leave that an employee may be entitled to, depending on certain cases, but those are the two in which their income will be supplemented by the federal government. And there has been a lot of talk about increasing some of these leaves, but again, some people may already have entitlements, and we'll come back to that because some people in their employment situation due to a union or an individual employment contract may be entitled to more of all the things I've talked about than the Employment Standards Act alone indicates. The Employment Standards Act is a minimum in every case. In the meantime, let's move on to the next slide. So here, and I was thinking that we were up to this, an employer may provide greater entitlements to its employees than the Employment Standards Act strictly requires. For example, more paid vacation, more notice of termination, longer and more paid absence. However, it may not give an employee less than those minimums. So in some cases, I mentioned if there is a union and a union contract, a union may negotiate for all its members that there be certain things that are more than just the statutory minimums. And if there's not, even if there's not a union, an employee who's not part of a union may negotiate an employment contract. And if they do, they may write into that they have vacation, if they're terminated, they have X amount of notice, more than the Employment Standards Act states is the minimum. That's totally legal if that's what the employer and the employee agree to do. However, again, the Employment Standards Act sets minimums, and anyone employed is entitled to those minimums and cannot agree to accept less, nor can an employer attempt to negotiate an employee to accept less. And we can move on. So if an employee's rights under the Employment Standards Act are not respected by an employer, the employee may file a complaint with the Ministry of Labor, and the ministry will investigate. And I have helped students to do this because there isn't a cost to it. There isn't really a risk to it. It takes some time because the Ministry of Labor receives a lot of employee complaints. So the process can be a little bit slow. But like I say, at least it is pretty well cost-free and risk-free. And I have helped students to go that route. If an employee, I mentioned before, has an employment contract where they're entitled to more, or for any other reason, because of length of employment or whatever, they're entitled to more than the statutory minimums, then that employee would be wise to go to court, usually small claims court, to claim what they're entitled to, because the Ministry of Labor will only fight for those minimums. Like I say, they're very effective in doing so, even though they're slow. They're effective in doing so, cost-free, risk-free. But if an employee is entitled to more than those minimums, then they won't get whatever more they're entitled to through the ministry's actions, they will need to go to small claims court. Again, I have assisted students in doing that. And we can move on. So there are also potential employment scams that students looking for employment should be aware of. Any job where the employer promises that the employee will receive a work permit may be attractive to international students, but an employer can't guarantee that. There may be circumstances in which the employer can provide the things that an employee would require to obtain a work permit, and that's fine. But let's see, first of all, if those conditions really do exist, and still the employer is not in a position to guarantee that that will be the outcome. So that's one red flag. Where the employee is expected to deposit checks and then withdraw funds. This is a big scam that I've seen sometimes. An employee is hired, will go to the bank with these checks, deposit them, and then withdraw the funds. Well, the checks turn out to be no good, and the bank comes after the employee, often a student, and I've seen them in that situation. So don't take on that kind of a job. Certainly a job working online may be fine, but it's wise to search online to make sure the employer actually exists and make sure that the work sounds ethical and the pay reasonable, and it doesn't sound like it's too good to be true, because it usually wouldn't be, and that the means of pay are reliable. Any online job that is legitimate, those things will all be discernible. The employer will be, visible online, will have an address that you can check and make sure, yes, they do exist, they do operate there. And then that the work sounds ethical, the pay reasonable, and that you'll really be paid, if there's recourse if you're not. So online jobs can be a way for people to be taken advantage of, unfortunately. And we can move on. And there I am. And I'm not wearing the same shirt, just the same color. But anyway, the email address to reach me at is shown there, w.a.reid, being my last name, at gmail.com. And normally, prior to the pandemic and the shutdowns, I was at Mohawk College at the Mohawk Student Association, part of every Thursday. But I have been providing the legal service remotely ever since the college and the Student Association closed temporarily, but as we know, that's pretty much still. And I'm going to be for this semester, I understand. But I am available by email, and I'm available more than just Thursdays. I'm available every business day, and I keep in touch with email even non-business days. So I do try to keep everything moving, and I realize that legal issues do arise every day, and they can develop every day. So I try to be available and to assist students as fully over email as I would in person. So I know that we presented a lot of somewhat detailed information, but my intention is not that students will be able to understand everything as if they're going to go and write a test on it. Instead, my intention is to mention issues so that, oh yeah, you can be aware of those issues. And in future, if things arise, oh yes, the lawyer mentioned something about this, so I should go back and look at that video again and contact the lawyer. And that's when we can discuss your individual situations, and I can provide individual legal advice and assistance to help you through your situations. And I believe that's pretty much all I need to say.